an organization which is itself a source of moral sufferings more terrible than death. Capital punishment is the most premeditated of murders, to which no criminal's deed, however calculated, can be compared. For there to be an equivalency, the death penalty would have to who had warned his victim of the date at which he would inflict a horrible death on him, and who, from that moment onward, had confined him at his mercy for months. Such a monster is not encountered in private life. Wow. Wow. We are gathered to put that monster to sleep forever. Thank you.
Please stand up, Claude Peugeot. An activist in France forever. She's written 2 books, both on Mumia and on Move, and she's always there. She's been active in the anti-death penalty movement as well, and shows up all over the world at conferences to fight for Mumia's inclusion. A lot of you know that they tried to exclude Mumia from, believe it or not, the anti-death penalty movement. They said it would hurt the movement to include him, and that the cops might not support them. Take a minute to have that sink in. We have 2 visitors from France. And we have Jack Lederer, who is also a longtime activist and intellectual in France, who is, and they'll be going to see Mumia tomorrow, and Jacques is working on recording a CD of a song Mumia is writing. Mumia has really gotten into music and is beginning to record, believe it or not. You can't stop Mumia from nothing. Francis Golden, Mumia's literary agent. All those books that Mumia writes and then get out there in the world, it's Francis's work. And we are very grateful. Heidi Bogosian, the head of the National Lawyers Guild. Please stand up so people see you. Has been a behind-the-scenes participant in all the legal processes and also key to the fundraising. Professor Tamika Cage, all the way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I say. And she's not only a wonderful intellectual and visits Mumia regularly and gorgeous besides, but she's also in one of the co-chairs of Educators for Mumia. Larry Holmes, International Action Center and Bailout. And why don't all the IAC people get up, stand up. All of you stand up. Always there for everything. Esperanza Martel. There she is. Whether it's dealing with a crisis on the bus when somebody threatens somebody in a fight, Espy steps in. Whether it's an internal struggle in the Mumia Coalition, whether it's getting young people involved, whatever it is, Espy is really part of the family, the Mumia family, in a very deep way. Ralph Pointer and Betty Davis of the Free Lynn Stewart Committee. Lynn, when she has to send a message, sends a message about Mumia. When they asked Lynn to send some message to the last workshop we had at the Left Forum, what did Lynn speak about? Mumia. And Ralph and Betty don't stop. I don't know how they do it. Like all our heroes and sheroes in prison, the stories of Lynn add to those chapters. And every time I hear another one, I say, oh my God, Lynn. You know, she's taken on a new role and she does her work. It's like Mumia used to say, you know, I was a journalist. And right now, prison is my beat. A round of applause and cheers for Lynn Stewart. And Freeland Stewart. Carolyn, from the campaign to end the death penalty. And we feel very close to the campaign to end the death penalty. And I want to commend the campaign to end the death penalty, particularly when this incident happened where people were saying, the right-wing section of the anti-death penalty was saying that Mumia should not be included. The campaign to end the death penalty took up that battle and said, we stand with Mumia, and they argued against the logic of playing to the police rather than to the oppressed people who are in prison. So thank you, Coley. Brenda Stokely, housing and all-around organizer. And Nellie Bailey, housing, Harlem Tenants Council. Is Viney Burrows here? I do want to take one last minute to introduce Tony Montero, who's a professor at Temple, who's been a friend of Mumia's and a supporter of Mumia's for a long time. And also, the last person I want to introduce is a sister who was just released from prison about 2 weeks ago, and who the prison ministry was involved in helping. Sundayata Sadiq was involved. We were all people were trying to help, and so this is the right moment to welcome her and acknowledge her. She is a fighter. Sister Fatima, could you please stand up? I don't want to do that. So, with all that said, I'm now going to introduce the attorneys themselves, okay? Because this is what we're here for. If they're speaking when Mumia calls, they know we stop. Whatever's happening, we stop. Of course, the thing that has won us over more than anything like paper credentials was seeing these two sisters in action. And really, that was inspiring and very reassuring to know that Mumia's fate is not completely in their hands. Of course, we never say that because it's also in all of our hands and in many other forces. But to know that the legal part is going to be led by them, when you watch them, you thought, okay, this makes sense. Judith Ritter is a professor of law, director of criminal defense clinic at Widener University School of Law's Delaware campus. She has been on the faculty there since 1994. She teaches and writes in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, and post-conviction remedies. Judy has also taught at Rutgers University School of Law, New Jersey and Hofstra University School of Law. She's a former associate counsel for Community Service Society of New York and a former public defender, having served as a staff and supervisor attorney at the Legal Aid Society of Nassau County. Professor Ritter is admitted to practice in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and in several federal courts, including the United States Supreme Court. We say this is the new team, but I want to make clear, and Mumia makes this clear all the time, these two women have been involved before. They're not new to this team, okay? They're new to being in charge of the team. That's right. Which makes a big difference. You know that who's in charge makes a big difference. But Judy represented Mumia has represented him since 2002. She worked on briefs. Many of the briefs you've read were written by her. Filed in both state and federal court on his behalf. She presented oral argument in the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, and again recently on November 9th, 2010, when we heard her and we're cheering her outside and in our hearts inside. She has been presenting the arguments pertaining to instructions given to the jury that sentenced Mumia to death. Whether or not he gets resentenced to death or not depends on these arguments. So she's had a very critical role and continues to have a very critical role. Christina Swarns is the director of the Criminal Justice Project of the NAACP, I'll say that part real fast, Legal Defense and Educational Fund, meaning that that's the organization. It's not the same as the NAACP. She is the director of the Criminal Justice Project of the Legal Defense Fund. In that capacity, she represents individuals charged and or convicted of criminal and capital offenses, prepares amicus briefs to various courts, including the United States Supreme Court, and assists in the coordination of nationwide strategies for criminal justice reform. The LDF is very actively involved in that in many, many forms. Prior to joining LDF, Christina worked as supervising assistant federal defender in the Capital Habeas Corpus Unit of the Philadelphia Federal Defender. She represented numerous Pennsylvania death sentence prisoners in their state post-conviction and federal habeas corpus appeals. Christina was one of the attorneys. She was one of the attorneys who represented Nicholas Yaris, the first death sentence prisoner in Pennsylvania to be exonerated by DNA evidence. Before joining the Federal Defender, Christina worked as staff attorney at Legal Aid Society Criminal Defense Division in Manhattan. Christina Swarns is in, I won't go into the graduate school and college and all that. She's amazing.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to all of you who worked so hard putting this event together, from organizing really months ago to publicizing to preparing wonderful food and a great event. That's, you've got a wonderful turnout, and thank you. And this is just, something that you're so good at putting together always. So we really appreciate it. I know that I saw many of you in the courtroom in Philadelphia, both in 2007 for the first oral argument in the federal appeals, and then again in just 2010, this past November. And many more of you were outside the courtroom, outside the courthouse, drawing attention to what was happening inside, supporting all of us, and working so hard. And all of you have been working, whether you've been in Philadelphia or you've been in New York or you've been all around the world working so tirelessly for Mumia. And I just want you to know that we appreciate this enormously, and we recognize how hard and how much time and money and energy and emotion you've all put in to keeping this case alive, keeping Mumia alive, and for keeping it in our memories and keeping it current, this trial that happened so long ago now, that was so unfair and so unjust, and keeping it in our minds and not letting the world forget about it. And that's really thanks to all of you and so many others. And I also want to, many of you have a relationship with Mumia, many of you know him personally, many of you know him from reading all the wonderful things he's written, and know him from listening to his radio addresses, or you've been in events, meetings where he's spoken. And so you know how sincerely he appreciates all of your support and how you keep this going on his behalf in the face of so much worry and so much pain over it. And hopefully we will hear from him. I find that he does get to make the phone calls when we ask, so I'm very optimistic, and he'll tell you that himself. But let me just tell you from Mumia how grateful he is, and I think you understand how sincere that gratitude is. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the status of the legal claims. And unfortunately, it's not very good news, the status of the legal claims, and I think that many of you know that. The efforts to win Mumia a new trial, because the trial that was held was so full of constitutional violations. Thank you. Was so full of constitutional violations. But the effort to win him a new trial, the efforts in state court, in federal court, lower courts, appellate courts, have essentially been rejected by those courts, one by one, over a number of years of efforts by, not me, I've only been working on part of it, but of many, many lawyers and many activists. And the claims, just to give you some examples of the claims that were strong, were meritorious, really had a lot of substance to them but have been rejected, include a claim of racial discrimination in jury selection, probably one of the strongest claims of this nature that the courts have seen, and yet it was rejected. Racial bias of the judge, the same judge, the trial judge, the post-conviction hearing judge, ineffective assistance of trial counsel, lots and lots of bases for that claim, improper prosecutorial argument during the trial and the penalty phase, witness intimidation, failing to disclose evidence that would have been helpful to the defense. Just an example, there have been almost about, I would say, between 40 and 50 separate legal claims that have been presented over the years and have been rejected. The one successful claim thus far has been to set aside the death sentence that was handed down in this case. And that, unfortunately, right now, whether that will remain the law of this case is in danger and is in doubt. And that's something I'm not sure everyone is fully aware of, and it's really terribly scary that the death penalty may very well be back on the table in this case. So you may remember that a federal court in Philadelphia, Judge Yan, in 2001, did set aside the death penalty. Why? Because the jury instructions essentially misled the jury that sentenced him and misled them about the way they could use the evidence that weighed against the death penalty, misled them about the weight that they could give that evidence. And because of that, the judge set aside the death penalty. And the district attorney appealed that finding, but the Third Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that and continued the ruling that the death penalty be set aside. Well, the Supreme Court was asked by the district attorney's office in Philadelphia to take a look at that case, and the Supreme Court of the United States sent it back to the Third Circuit and said, you know what, take another look at it. We just issued an opinion, they said, coming out of Ohio. That means we're a little tougher about these cases, so why don't you take another look and see if you still believe that the death penalty was unjust. And it's that issue that I argued in November of this year, whether even despite that new case, the injustice in the penalty phase here hasn't changed a bit, and the way the law sees it shouldn't change a bit either. And that's the decision we're currently waiting upon, whether the Third Circuit will stick to their guns and continue to hold that the death penalty should be vacated in this case or not. So what could happen? Well, there are a number of things that could happen. If the Third Circuit reaffirms its earlier opinion, then I think the district attorney will ask the Supreme Court to look at it again. They may or may not be successful, but I think they will ask. And then, depending, of course, upon what happens there, at some point, the district attorney's office, we anticipate, although it's their choice to make, will seek a new penalty trial. Will seek to have a new death sentence implemented by a new jury. Because setting aside the death penalty, while it was a big, important victory, of course, just means that they can try again and instruct the jury properly. So that's something that could develop as we go forward. Of course, the Third Circuit, which, by the way, a lot of people ask me, well, do you know when they're going to decide? And I don't. But it could be tomorrow, and it could be weeks or months from now. I don't know. But if they decide, if they change their minds and they say, no, we don't think the death penalty should have been set aside. We think it was okay and it should remain. Well, we can go to the U.S. Supreme Court and ask the U.S. Supreme Court to review that decision. And then, again, depending on what happens there, we go back to the federal lower court because there were a number of bases for the setting aside of the death penalty that judge just didn't reach because we won on the one claim. So we'll go back there if we're unfortunately in that position. There's plenty of litigation yet to come with regard to the death penalty, but I think that I know that you know, and I hope you'll let people know that this is still very much a death penalty case. But there is good news, and the good news is that LDF is taking the case, has taken the case. And Mumia has retained LDF. So Christina and I have seen him a lot recently, and I can tell you, I talk to him on the phone regularly, and we've seen him. He is very, very comforted by this. He's very pleased, grateful. He doesn't like to dwell on himself much at all. It's unbelievably amazing, but he doesn't. But he is very, very relieved that the case is in the hands of this new team. And the Criminal Justice Project of LDF, headed by Christina Swarns, who I've known for a long time, will be taking the lead in the case. And they are not new, as Suzanne said, they are not new to this case. Christina argued the issue of jury selection discrimination several years ago brilliantly, and she and her co-workers wrote an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief then. That was an excellent, excellent brief. But that was a different role. And this role is much more central to what we're doing. They are, joining the defense, and they are lending their amazing staff, the staff of the Criminal Justice Project, lawyers, organizers. It's such a pleasure to be working with them. And they were a bunch of smart, energetic, committed, tireless lawyers. And this is really, truly wonderful, wonderful news for this case. So I think I'm going to let Christina tell you a little bit more about them. And thank you again for having this wonderful event.
It's 5 to 6, and probably Christina will be interrupted, but she's cool. I didn't say enough about the history of the LDF, and hopefully she will. What this means, really historically, to have. When we heard about it, we said we had to have a big greeting, a big celebration. And literally, I think right after they did their press release, we started organizing for this event because we knew this was a historic break in Mumia's case.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It really is an honor to be here with all of you this evening. I have to tell you that I have been representing people on death row, I was trying to remember, and I'm just going to admit it, for 15 years now. I've represented people on death row in Pennsylvania, in Texas, in Arkansas. We have cases in Alabama. We work all over the South. 95% of the time it is, as you can imagine, an isolating experience for us to go into the South and advocate on behalf of African American men who have been charged and condemned to die by the government. We walk into courtrooms, we aren't often welcome. We don't get quite the kind of response we got today. So you'll give me a moment to appreciate this is something I have to take in. So it is absolutely my honor to be with all of you tonight. I have to echo Judy's sentiment that we are really here, and we have no doubt in our minds, because of you all. And we do stand on the shoulders of giants, and the giants in this movement in this case are in this room. And so I want to thank all of you for all of the work that you have done for 30 years. And keeping this case alive and in keeping Mumia alive. So I first want to extend my thanks from the legal team and from the Legal Defense Fund to all of you. Thank you so much. It is absolutely my honor to represent Mumia Abu-Jamal. It is my pleasure, it is my honor to have that opportunity. And there's no question in my mind, there's no question in the mind of anyone at the Legal Defense Fund that the justice system has utterly and completely failed Mumia Abu-Jamal. And in our view, that has everything to do with race. And that is why the Legal Defense Fund is in this case. LDF was founded in 1940 with one express and clear mission that holds as applicable today as it did in 1940, and that is to achieve racial justice, equality, and an inclusive society. That struggle is as important and as alive today as it was in 1940. We began as an arm, the legal arm of the NAACP. Our first director counsel was Thurgood Marshall, who, as you all know, went on to become the first African-American Supreme Court Justice of the United States. LDF is best known, I think, for having been the lawyers who brought integration, school desegregation, to this country in a case called Brown versus Board of Education. But what I want you to know is that this organization has, since its inception, been dedicated to the elimination of racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. We are, by our founding, an organization that is committed to the abolition of the death penalty. We are acutely aware that the injustices of the criminal justice system are inextricably bound up in race. And so since the beginning, LDF has been doing criminal justice work. Thurgood Marshall himself went into the South and represented African American men who were charged with rape of white women in the South, and as you all know, that was, for that time, it would mean automatically a death sentence, if not a lynching. So we have been fighting this fight since we started. We are now completely separate from the NAACP. We are two entirely independent organizations. We have been separate since 1957, so it's not news. But we have two totally unrelated boards, everything, staff, totally unrelated. But LDF, I just want you to understand, has been in this fight and is committed to this fight for racial justice in the United States and in criminal justice. LDF brought the only successful constitutional challenge to the death penalty in 1972 in a case called Furman versus Georgia. It was our office that temporarily ended the death penalty in 1972. It was LDF that brought the only significant challenge to the broad, destructive role of race in the death penalty in 1986. We brought a case called McCleskey versus Kemp, where we said, we have shown by statistical evidence that black men are more likely than any other race, black men who kill white women are more likely than any other combination of race of defendant and race of victim to receive the death penalty. That means that race, it's not the crime, it's not the victim, it's not anything else that's happening here. It is race that is deciding who lives and who dies, and that's unconstitutional. That was our position in 1986.
Are you there? Yeah.
Oh, they cut us off, guys. Oh! No! They cut us off.
I just wanted to say thank you all, brothers, sisters, friends, for coming out today. I just wanted to do a few things to let y'all know that if you've ever read any of the legal briefs in the past, the last few years, and you found them compelling, well done, or even interesting, the two lawyers, the two women which are meeting tonight, wrote them. And if you've seen oral arguments in the last few years, you've no doubt been impressed by their mastery of the issues, the cases, and the material. You've met them, you know them. I really just want to welcome them again from the NAACP LDF, Christina Swarns, and law professor Judith Ritter.
As to I thank you, welcome, and thank you.
Thank you.
Mumia?
Good.
Yeah, the lawyers got an uncommon reception for lawyers. Let me tell you, this crowd gave us the warmest reception possible. So you should know that you're following on that. We have some people who want to ask you questions, okay? All right, here we go. Hi, Mumia. My name is Nina Saxon. I represent the Riverside Prison Ministry. My question is, how do we get young people into this struggle? All right.
I tell you this, there are so many problems facing the country, not just the black community, but the nation as a whole, that this should be the easiest time in the world to get people involved. If it isn't, it's just because they're involved in something else or they feel as if they can't make a difference. But once you explain to them that if they don't get involved in trying to change the situation, it can only get worse and worse for them and for their children.
And their grandchildren.
So if they get involved, they can change the world. And we have to get involved.
It's glad I've been here a number of times, and I'm just overjoyed to hear your voice and what this person would say. I just want to ask you, what lessons can young people learn from the election of Barack Hussein Obama? What do you learn?
Well, that politics is never over on election night. A lot of people kind of felt like they achieved, especially young people, and let's not say it, black people. A lot of people felt that they had made history, that this was a different country, that this really was a different world. And unfortunately, what they found out in the last year or two is that it's a whole lot like it was before. Yeah. It is because the President of the United States is intelligent, literate, many of the things that the former president wasn't. So there's many of the same problems that we face, that the people around the world face, continue to play us and them. And in fact, in some instances, have gotten worse. So I think that people should learn that election night is not the end, it's the beginning. And people have begun then, that is in November, I think, 2008, to protest, to demonstrate, and to speak their minds. Well, we might not be involved in a new war. People might have gotten some of the benefits of all those billions and trillions of dollars that went to Wall Street. Maybe they could have gone to school instead, really got the money. People have forgotten, I think, that protests make differences. They've forgotten the role of social movements. Social movements change American history. In many places, they change world history. Once we remember that, then we're able to begin to change history as it is now and create a better future.
Mumia spoke to us about imperialism and colonialism and the fight back.
You said colonialism?
Yeah.
We're living in a neo-colonial era. And I say that internationally, not just nationally. That's what Libya is about. That's what many of the struggles around the world are about, because people are resisting and fighting back against neo-colonial leaders. You know, people. When I was 14, I had the pleasure, it was really my job, I was forced to do it. I had the duty to read Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon. Great book. I commend it to any of you. It's a hard book to read, but it's necessary because he teaches us all. The price if governments are neo-colonial, if they do not truly fight for political and economic independence and liberation. And because many African countries didn't do it, and because many Arab countries didn't do it, well, now we see the price 30, 35, 40 years later. All of those governments were puppets of the West. The most brutal in the world were actually puppets of the West.
My question, what are the strategies do you propose for the grassroots to help you in your freedom?
Organized. People who've been around a few years recognize that that's a quote from Kwame Ture, formerly known as Dr. Carlin. Every time he spoke, whether it was in Atlanta, Georgia, or Albany, Georgia, or Mississippi, or Philadelphia, West Africa, he spoke those words. And truer words were rarely spoken. Organized. I know that a lot of young girls think this is the Facebook generation or the Twitter generation. And truth be told, they're very important. They can do a whole lot of things that people could not do in 1966, or 1968, or 1970, or 1985. But that's what? The best way to organize is to sit down and talk to people. And not through a machine, but face to face. And to spend time with you. And while you don't think you have that time, I bet you're doing a whole lot more, playing video games. Or something like that. Than talking to people. And that's a powerful organizing tool.
Hey, yo, my brother. My name is Ref. I'm a hip-hop artist in a rap group called Circuit 95 out of New York City. And my question was, I wanted you to speak a little bit about the revolutionary legacy that artists in general, but hip-hop specifically, has to keep alive, you know what I'm saying?
Well, like many art forms that have been created by black folks in the last century, they have been co-opted. That is, they have been captured by corporate interests. And the most radical and the most progressive art forms have rarely been heard. If you're talking about something other than your bling, your thing, how many cars you got, how many bitches you got, well, you're not going to make it on BET or MTV or VH1 or anything like that. And that's a corporate kind of cutout and shutout of a certain kind of music because, music is a powerful thing. We forget about it sometimes because, as black people for the most part, we're surrounded by it all day long. When black people were marching and facing off against terrorism in the South, in the Civil Rights Movement, every step they took was accompanied by a song. We call them Riverside, but they refreshed and emboldened and inspired many young people to stand up against, dog attacks, water hoses, and black attacks, and prison, and all of those kinds of things. So music has a power that we must all pay attention to. And I would say that, to those young people who are hip-hop artists, just inject the truth, the resistance of the people, the history of the people into your music, and you'll make it timeless. You'll make it something that people will listen to years from now, not just, the next hot hit. You're worthy of some truth.
Greetings, Mumia. My name is Bob Lederer. I'm with Resistance in Brooklyn. And first, I just want to say what a great honor it is for me to speak to you after being inspired by your commentaries and books for all these years. And my question is about all of that incredible productivity and brilliance that has emanated from your cell on death row for coming up on 30 years, and you're now approaching your 57th birthday. What has kept your spirit strong? What has kept you going through all of the heartaches that you've witnessed and through missing a lot of the growth and development of your children and grandchildren? How do you stay strong?
Well, thanks for that question, Bob. It has been a long, hard struggle. I am blessed, and I am blessed with a loving family. You've heard about my children, grandchildren, but people like you as well.
Yeah.
I'm inspired when I see that all around the world.
Just the reaction that we got when we can hear y'all. We can hear y'all cheering for us just to know that we're on the phone together.
Right.
That's inspirational.
That was a beautiful thing.
It really was.
Well, maybe the clock is run out.
Okay, Mumia, round there for Lynn Stewart. No question, but we are with you. We will not fail you. We dare not fail you. We dare not fail you.
That went into making that happen. I want to thank the electronic people. I want to thank Johnny Stevens. I want to thank Johnny and Ann Lamb for live streaming this right now. This is being streamed live around the world. Today's event is literally being watched and heard around the world. It's not just us, and look how powerful we alone would be. But with all those people listening around the world, the power is infinite. And with Mumia sending the kind of message he did, I'm still blown away. I'm really blown away. So let's a round of applause for Mumia again. And thank you also to our wonderful questioners who came up, each of them, with such a good, they didn't even know what the others were saying, but they were just such wonderful questions. And I'm sure Mumia, being a teacher in every bone of his body, loved it. Loved the opportunity to answer those questions. Originally, he had said, well, why don't I just send a message? I said, Mumia, don't you really love those questions? He said, yeah, I really do. So, all right, Christina, with all due apology, we still want to hear you really continue and take your time. We're not in a hurry.
Thank you. It was wonderful to hear from Mumia, and of course, I'm happy to always cede my time to Mumia. But as I was explaining, LDF has been in this fight, the fight that is at the center of Mumia's case since the beginning. We are committed to the elimination of racial discrimination and the role of race in the administration of the criminal justice system and in the administration of the death penalty, period. It is what I do. That is the job that I do. So it was an easy ask when it came up. Could we come into this case? Should we come into this case? It was easy for us to say clearly, this is the most important case, the most important death penalty case, and we have to come into this case.
Right on.
We came in because we know that justice remains elusive for Mumia, just like it does for countless other African American men on death row in this country, because race plays a role in the administration of criminal justice and in capital punishment. We did it because we know that race dictates who lives and who dies in this country. History shows it, research shows it, and a lot of other evidence shows it. I think it's impossible to even begin to look at this case, to think about this case, to understand what's happening in this case without understanding the history of the death penalty in this country and understanding the origins of the death penalty in this country. We have to know and we have to understand that the death penalty in this country is a direct descendant of slavery. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about that history because I just want everyone to be clear, and this is why LDF is so committed to the struggle and so firmly committed to the view that there is no way to talk about the death penalty without talking about race. Those two things cannot be untangled. They are forever tied together in this country. The death penalty is the child of slavery. It is the child of this country's darkest days of racial slavery and segregation. It was and is a legal way to use violence to control and oppress the descendants of African Americans. Violence, of course, was the central means of controlling and maintaining slavery in this country. There was no other way that this country could keep thousands and thousands and millions of African Americans, of Africans in control without using absolute brute force. And that's what it did. Slavery was brutal, and that a period. The violence was rampant. Black lives had no value under slavery. After the Civil War ended, violence continued to be a primary weapon against African Americans in this country in order to maintain the socioeconomic status quo. In the post-war Reconstruction period, the Southern states were required to accept the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which granted blacks constitutional rights as citizens, as conditions of entry into the Union, back into the United States. And during that time, as you know, progressive coalitions of African Americans and whites worked together and ran Southern states. They enacted significant civil rights legislation, and during that time, black people began slowly to make gains coming out of slavery. Despite the fact that blacks were significant minorities in all of the Southern states outside of South Carolina, this progress was extremely resented by the Southern whites. This hostility was undoubtedly a product of a lot of things, but most primarily because the Southern states were economically dependent on the labor provided by black people in the South. And so to the extent that African Americans progressed, that social structure, that economic structure was jeopardized. So because keeping black people in their place, in the most controlled place, put kindly, the white Southerners had to find a way to thwart the Reconstruction progress. And that is how the Klan and other terrorist organizations were born. During the time of Reconstruction, the Klan and other terrorist organizations emerged and embarked on a campaign of murdering and terrorizing black people and progressive whites who were working with them. Ultimately, they were successful, and the Southern whites took control of the South. They changed the laws, imposed racial segregation and disfranchisement, and shoved black people back into the lowest rungs of society and essentially recreated slavery in a different name for many years. The violence didn't end with the reinstallation of Southern white leaders, however, because again, they needed the economic support system that free labor, poor free black labor provided. And so the violence continued. The boundaries between African Americans and whites were enforced by brutal mob terror, lynching, and race riots. Between 1882 and 1968, 1,297 white people were lynched. 3,445 black people were lynched in the United States. That's over 100 people a year, mostly black, were lynched between 1882 and the turn of the century. This continued. The only reason the rate of lynching started to abate was when the Southern states started to adopt the death penalty. The death penalty became a legal lynching. So the 100 per year rate of lynchings in the South were replaced by a similar number of death sentences that began to be meted out in the 1930s. And I would need to be very clear about this because there were instances, numerous instances, where judges would simply come out of courthouses and tell gathering lynch mobs, you don't have to worry because I'm going to do what you need me to do. There is going to be a death sentence here. And so they were able to avoid the unseemly spectacle, what became an unseemly spectacle of lynching, by imposing death sentences. The racial disparities in the administration of the death penalty in the early years bears this out. 89% of those who were executed for the crime of rape between 1930 and 1972 were black. That is simply social control. Black men should not get out of place and shouldn't speak to or think of speaking to a white woman, or they were going to be lynched one way or another. The link between lynchings and the death penalty can still be seen today. The states with a significant history of lynching also have the higher number of death sentences today. So these two things are bound together. And so it's important to understand that history when you ask yourself why it would be that an outspoken African-American man, a critic of the police, and an advocate for communities of color in Philadelphia in 1981 wound up being capitally prosecuted and sentenced to death. Because the death penalty, as Michelle Alexander's book describes very eloquently, is a weapon of social control, and that has always been. Race plays out today. We know that Black people make up 12% of the population. We are 41% of all condemned prisoners in the United States. Researchers have looked really closely at why is this happening? Why is it that Black people are so disproportionately represented among those on death row? They've compared cases, Black defendants and white defendants, with similar facts, and repeatedly, time and again, study after study has showed that it is race, not the terribleness of the crime, not the background of the offender, not the circumstances of the victim. It is race that is the most significant factor that it creates a likelihood of getting a death sentence. In fact, a study in Philadelphia itself showed Black defendants face odds of receiving the death penalty 4 times greater than similarly situated white defendants. Again in Philadelphia, another study showed that Black defendants with more stereotypically Black features, darker skin, a broader nose, are more likely to get the death penalty in Philadelphia if they have a white victim. That researcher called that phenomenon looking death-worthy. So Mumia, this case is just an extension of this cultural phenomenon that derives from slavery and from lynching that links race to criminality, to violence, to human worthlessness, a perception of human worthlessness. We know that race also plays a role when you look at the victims in capital cases. Black people are half of murder victims in this country nationwide. Half of all murder victims in this country are African American. 14% of the victims of those who have been executed were Black. 14. So unless there's some reason to believe that white people are killed in more gruesome ways, by worse people, by some set of facts that bears no sense and logic and there is no research to bear it out, it means that decision makers are making value judgments about the lives of Black victims relative to white victims. It means they're saying that white victims, the offenders who kill, allegedly, white victims, are worse than the offenders who kill Black victims. That, again, Black lives are not worth as much as white lives. And then you have to think about who is deciding at the end of the day who gets sentenced to death. Most of the decision makers in death cases are juries. There's a second phase of the trial where a jury is asked to look at only the question of whether a person who's been convicted of capital murder should live or should die. And we know from all of the cases that I've litigated, and almost all of them, and through my colleagues across the country, the prosecutors take great pains in this country to make sure that African Americans do not get the opportunity to participate in that decision. They use the power that they have to exclude prospective jurors on racial grounds. And we know this happened in Philadelphia because there was a videotape of a training session in Philadelphia where the prosecutor explained in exquisite detail to his colleagues how they could and should go about making sure that Black people did not get seated on juries. And we know that happened in Mumia's case. So where does that leave us? It means that at the end of the day, what we have was Mumia Abu-Jamal in 1981. Before he went on trial, the newspaper coverage was all about race. They talked about Mumia's affiliations with various African American organizations, with MOVE, the Black Panther Parties, the National Association of Black Journalists. We know they went on at length about his high school involvement in political advocacy. They went out of their way to talk about how Mumia worked for black media outlets and focused on issues that were important to African Americans. They talked about his hair, how he wore it in dreadlocks. I'm going to quote one article from before the trial. Several prospective jurors left the courtroom Tuesday saying they were too upset and afraid to serve after being questioned by Abu-Jamal, who wears his hair in the dreadlock style of the Move sect. I don't even, well, I know. They went on to comment that he was interested in Rastafarianism, that he was born Wesley Cook, but he changed his name, that African Americans had formed a defense fund in support of him, and that Move members supported his defense. What any of this has to do with what happened that night in December of 1981, you'll have to ask them, but it has nothing to do with whether he did it or not, or who shot Daniel Faulkner that night. That's all about race and making sure that race was an important part of this case before it was tried. We know that once it got into the courtroom, Mumia's prosecutor made sure that black people didn't get a chance to serve on that jury. And we know that he did that consistently. Between 81 and 83, the prosecutor in this case excluded African American prospective jurors almost 3 times as often as he excluded prospective white jurors. This was part of a systematic attempt to exclude African Americans. And we know that that DA's office had done that consistently during that time and after. The Supreme Court noted in a different case that a comprehensive statistical studies of Philadelphia County death penalty cases tried between 81 and 97 shows that in 317 capital trials, prosecutors struck 51% of black jurors and 26% of non-black jurors. That's Philadelphia County. And we know that the trial judge in this case was overheard saying he was going to help fry the nigger. That's right. So this case is all about race. People will tell us that it is not, that this is about simply about the shooting of a police officer. That is not true. The Legal Defense Fund knows that is not true, and that is why we are here today. So we look forward to working with all of you. I do want to say very clearly, we are a team. I am a team. Everything I do is part and parcel of the work of a larger group of people. I have the honor and privilege of